All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the first panel session of the Bright Blue and British Future online conference, focusing on what next for immigration. My name is Nikita Malik. I am the Deputy Director of Bright Blue, and I will be chairing the panel today. This panel will focus on the topic for migration for work beyond Brexit and COVID-19. We are delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel of speakers this afternoon. After our panel presents their introductory remarks and answers initial questions, we will be taking questions from the audience. So please submit your questions to Slido by searching for #ImmigrationWork, which is one word. So I will begin by introducing the panel. We are joined today by Martin McTagg from the Federation of Small Businesses. Martin is FSB's elected policy and advocacy chair. He works closely with government and opposition leaders to represent the needs of FSB's members, including on immigration and visa policy. Thank you for joining us, Martin. We are also joined by Brendan Ryan, the chief executive of Nomadic. Nomadic is a startup dedicated to providing the next generation of business visa and immigration document procurement services. Previously, Brendan spent more than 2 decades in Australian government, including at the Department of Immigration. Thanks for joining us, Brendan. We are further delighted to welcome Madeleine Sumption, the Director of Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Madeleine is a policy specialist focusing on the impacts of migration policies and the role of migrants in the labour market. She is a member of the Migration Advisory Committee, an independent panel that advises the UK government on migration issues. Thanks for joining us, Madeleine. On our panel is also Heather Rolfe, Director of Research and Relationships at British Future. She was previously Head of Research at Demos and has extensive research experience on the economic and social impact of migration, including public attitudes. Welcome, Heather. And finally, we are joined by Salma Shah, a former Special Advisor to the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, from 2018 to 2019. Salma is a political consultant and also a policy fellow at the Centre for Science and Policy. Previously, Salma served in the UK government at departments including DCMS, the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, and at the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Thank you for joining us, Salma. So we're very grateful for everyone's time today and really excited about the topics that we're going to discuss, particularly around the keynote speech and some of the comments that we've just heard from the Home Secretary. So in her speech, the Home Secretary talked about the introduction of a new border scheme requiring visitors to apply for an electronic travel authorization, ETA, before coming to the UK. This model is similar to many international models, including the US-style digital visa system. Given this panel is about immigration for work, I will begin by asking the speakers what effect, if any, these changes have had on migration for work, particularly following the UK's exit from the EU. So perhaps, Martin, we could start with you and we could have everyone speak for 3 minutes before we begin with more general questions.
Okay, thanks, Nikita. The first thing to say is really COVID has hit SMEs very hard, especially in the retail, leisure and hospitality sectors. But confidence is slowly returning and we're now facing radically different markets. We've got an EU border that has got a lot more friction than there was 15 months ago. There is a massive tech adoption process going on and there is pressure on climate adoption. So in other words, net zero, the move towards net zero. Now, the points-based system creates both challenges and opportunities. The challenges are that with a furlough system that's winding down, a lot of people are staying put. They're not moving from their existing companies until the end of September. But that means there are really serious skills gaps opening, and it's very difficult to respond to these tech and net zero changes. Now, you could say the opportunity is we can now recruit globally, but virtually no SMEs have any experience of the immigration system. They will need time to adapt. They'll certainly need support and guidance, and they need significantly lower costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Perhaps we could move to Brendan. Brendan, Martin discussed the points-based system. Very interested in your thoughts on that, but also the new ETAs that were announced earlier today.
Sure. So, look, I come at this, with 20 years of experience as a partner in Fragaman, where we focused on the business community needs and have the ability to sort of do a comparison of the UK to other countries from the user experience. Overall, I think the UK has a very good immigration system, and it actually stacks up well against most other countries when you talk about the business-related elements. But I have to agree with Martin that where there is a real problem is that the UK has not yet experienced the full impact of Brexit, and that impact has been masked by the pandemic. And so there is a real risk that unintended outcomes could really hit the economy very quickly. Whether the UK likes it or not, the perception is that it is not a particularly good location for regional headquarters anymore. And in addition, I agree that the current system, which I do believe works quite well, and the reforms are welcome, but I do believe that it is not friendly for small to medium enterprise in the United Kingdom, and they will be disproportionately impacted by the loss of free movement, and that we haven't seen the impact of that yet. So one of the areas that the UK needs to look at immediately is the potential for a relaxation in business travel restrictions and what that could mean in the short to medium term, as many of these reforms, including the Electronic Travel Authority, comes into play. And I think that there is a lot of opportunity for immediate action within the current framework to be able to reduce the impact and provide a buffer to business in a post-Brexit world. And one of the issues, as I said, focus on small to medium enterprise and reduce the cost, which in the past has been used as a deterrent to large numbers, but now could be a major impact on the economy.
Thank you. I'll now move to Madeleine for your thoughts on the recent changes, but also as Brendan was speaking, whether this represents an opportunity for a post-Brexit new system.
Thanks. So, I mean, at the risk of stating the obvious, ending free movement obviously is a really big change. And I think one of the inevitable consequences of that essentially is just that we can't anticipate all of the impacts that it's going to have. Free movement obviously has been used in quite different ways. So a lot of the policy debate was about the kind of workers in low wage jobs, but there are other categories that we don't actually know as much about, like, for example, self-employed people, entrepreneurs, various shades of businesses hopping back and forth, doing activities that actually kind of permission-based immigration systems like the one that we now have often struggle to accommodate particularly smoothly. Now, I would agree with Brendan on this. I mean, COVID has in some ways delayed the impacts of the new system, and so they're not currently fully visible. And I think it will be really interesting to see in the coming years. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more sort of policy tweaks trying to kind of address some of the unintended consequences that might crop up when you have any big policy change of this nature. So that's one thing. I guess on the big COVID question, I think an interesting question here is, if we had known that COVID was coming, should policymakers have done things differently? I'll be interested in other people's view on that question. I'm actually not totally convinced that that is the case, at least from an economic perspective. My view is basic. I mean, you may or may not like the new system on its own merits, but I think the fundamental economic arguments either for and against it aren't actually that different now as they compared to what they were a few years ago. I mean, you could argue on the one hand, okay, we need a more liberal system now because there are certain groups of work, obviously health and social care workers, for example, that there's particularly high demand for. You could also say, well, actually, we should have a more restrictive system now because of rising unemployment. And in practice, I think basically it's always quite difficult to flex the system to try and accommodate those kind of short-term developments. Realistically, government has to develop a system that's going to work for the medium term, because by the time you've tried to address the short term, something else has replaced it. Now, public opinion may have changed, and that's a different matter, but one that I'm not going to get into because I think Heather's going to address that.
Thank you, Madeleine. So I'll move on to Heather, and perhaps you want to pick up there on public opinions or any other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I do. So the picture that we painted so far is that we're going to probably come out of the recession and we'll recover from COVID relatively rapidly, and there'll be pressure on the new immigration system. And I think, but it's not just going to be from small employers, it's going to be from employers who employ lower skilled labour. And of course, no provision was made in the new immigration system for lower skilled workers to come via the system. A lot of what the Secretary said today was about highly skilled migration, and the reason why there was no specific route for lower skilled migration is that it was thought to be what the public wanted. The British Future, obviously, we've been looking at what the public have been saying before the referendum and since, and it's true, I think Ryan alluded to this, that public concerns are focused on competition for jobs, pressure on resources, whether migrants are contributing, integration and security, which was mentioned a lot by the Home Secretary, and the concept of control has featured quite strongly in debate and in the public mind, including keeping out criminals. But when it comes to migration for work, people are much more favourable to higher skilled migration, which we have a route for now, and a much better route than we had in the past, one that's much easier for employers. But we don't have for lower skilled. Now, the public is less supportive of lower skilled migration, but that isn't necessarily about need, it's about contribution, with higher skilled workers seen to contribute more and less likely to be in need of state support. And people also see competition between migrants and locals for lower skilled jobs, or believe that the unemployed should be required to do them. But when the public's asked about specific jobs, they're much more pragmatic and recognise the need to fill vacancies in sectors such as health and social care, construction, and even fruit picking. We've also seen attitudes change since the referendum, which is something that Ryan talked about. 45% of people now say migration has a positive impact. And of those who said they'd become more positive, more than half say it's because of discussions that have highlighted migrant contributions. This is likely to have been amplified by the pandemic, with increased awareness of the role of key workers in sectors like retail and delivery, as well as health and social care. And so I think these trends in public attitudes suggest that the public may be more sympathetic than assumed to adapting the points-based system to meet shortages of lower skilled workers, which might otherwise damage the economy. The Home Secretary talked of the importance of listening to the British public, and it's important that politicians continue to do that as attitudes change with the new points-based system and with COVID recovery. I think just finally, it's important to say that attitudes will also be influenced by whether people's expectations for a post-COVID as well as post-Brexit deal are met. And the Home Secretary did refer to this. So the government is promising kind of regional development, regional investment. Employers and people in the regions and the government need to ensure that these promises are met and that they're followed through, so that people have the opportunity to do skilled and meaningful work. And this relies on improved training, career paths, and all the things that employers have been encouraged to do as the immigration system changes.
Thank you, Heather, for your comments. I'll now move on to Salma and any thoughts you may have on the points-based immigration system, but also on the Home Secretary's speech that was prior to this panel.
So I'm a former political advisor, and as Heather has just talked about public opinion and what people think, I suppose I'm the natural progression from that in terms of what politicians then want to do with what the public think. I was a special advisor when we put out the immigration white paper just prior to Brexit, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the context of that was pretty fraught. So just going back to some of the earlier comments on this panel, with the idea of small to medium-sized businesses having to adjust to a huge new regulatory burden around migration, I think a lot of that, plus COVID, has created the practical issue of not having any time for the new system to bed in. So you recall all sorts of shenanigans about whether we were no dealing or going to have a deal back when Theresa May was still Prime Minister, and then COVID having implications on travel and actually being able to conduct business. So I think that context is really important. From a political perspective, I thought that the Home Secretary's speech was very much in line with things that she's always said before. And when we think about, and Heather's just mentioned this, the skills for the route for low skill immigration, there has always been a reluctance because politically, where you have what used to be the Labour heartlands and is now the Red Wall, people do care about low-skilled migration. It's where it sort of impacts the most, because there's always been a view that that creates a downward pressure on salaries, which then exacerbates what we see as community tension. So I think the fact that the Home Secretary is continually pushing that message and trying to address those issues has a very strong political purpose as well. And just very quickly, from a Whitehall perspective, so let's put the politics aside, the Home Secretary's job is primarily one of security. So I'm quite interested to understand really what is the Treasury's position or the Business Department's position on some of the routes that have been created, and how much of that is actually solely about what the Home Secretary sees as, protection of the borders and, applying rules and making sure. I mean, we heard a lot of that from what she said. You've got to respond to the rules, and we've got to crack down on illegal immigration, and we've got to count people in and out. So the electronic travel authorization, I think, is part of her sort of pushing out there the idea that actually the Home Secretary's primary purpose is that of security and not economic considerations. And just with that, the whole idea of the digitization of the border and moving into a more digital border, I think, is an interesting one. And, we are not there yet. And I think there's a deadline set for 2025 for the digitization of the border. So we are probably going to see a lot more changes before we see a real settled immigration patterns and practicalities around how we deliver the immigration system.
Thank you, Salma. So I'll move on to my second question, picking up from what you said, which is, you identified perhaps one of the gaps is this marrying of Treasury needs and Treasury opinions with the Home Secretary's announcements, and that we will need time to see whether those two go well together. More broadly, looking at the points-based system in particular, what gaps, if any, do you see in this firm and fair points-based system, in what the British economy will need to build back better after Brexit and after the pandemic? So perhaps I'll start with you, Salma, and then go around the other way, so we can go that way.
So my sort of worry about the points-based system, I'll try and take a practical example, is that, once you've been in government, no matter how sort of right-wing and conservative you are, you have this tendency to want to centralise everything and sort of retain some kind of control and levers on power. And the way that the system was set up previously with the tiers was interesting because it gave more state control. You could pull levers to sort of create more space in X sector or decrease space in Y sector. The problem with tipping it over to points-based generally is that you put the onus on the applicant wanting to choose Britain as the place that they want to come to. And that is slightly problematic from a centralising viewpoint, because if you add things like, okay, we need to have 10 points for a certain level of English speaking, for example, then how do we compete against the US, for example? So let's take this tech sector. There are some amazing Indian analysts and IT experts who are choosing America over the UK at the moment. And I don't feel that the points-based system at the moment is being able to incentivize them in the way that it did before. So I think that is one of the issues that we are going to have to address as we sort of test this new system and start seeing where the gaps come up.
Thank you. So Heather, would you agree that maybe one of the gaps in the points-based system is that it's not incentivizing enough, and do systems like the Home Secretary discuss the UK-India migration partnership for young professionals? Is that a way to somehow fill in some of these gaps where we might lose individuals to other countries, like Salma said?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the young professionals from India are going to be working in hospitality or social care, frankly. That's not going to be a draw for them. Neither is it going to be a draw for people who are here on the Youth Mobility Scheme, although the Youth Mobility Scheme is a great thing for young people. So the problem, the gap, the main gap in the system is this lack of a route for lower skilled. So the sectors such as food processing, hospitality, social care, to a certain degree retail, they have relied on migrants for many years, predating free movement. And, I can see big problems if they're not allowed to recruit who they need. We've had some flexibility since the new system was drawn up on the salary side of things, which would obviously be welcome to employers, but absolutely no flexibility on this intermediate skill level. And a lot of jobs in those sectors that I mentioned are below that level, and I think that's the major gap. The flexibility is built into the system, as Madeleine can explain more. And I think there'll be a reluctance to use that flexibility, because I think it will be seen as giving up control. But as I said, the public actually sees the need for migration in those sectors. And I think that the government would face less opposition to flexibilities than it's probably anticipating.
Thank you. So Madeleine, would you agree with that? That we're perhaps with the points-based system, a gap could be that we're losing middle-skilled workers in that way, or are there other gaps that you feel we should be focusing on as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, use the word gaps, which I guess sort of implies that these are gaps that need to be filled. And some of them obviously are gaps that are deliberately unfilled, right? So the lack of sponsorship options for people coming to work in low wage jobs, this is the government's policy is that there shouldn't be a route, and that employers will have to adjust in various ways. There are other areas where you could talk about gaps in the sense of that the government would probably like to fill them. It's just that it's really hard, and the system struggles to accommodate that. And I think the big one there is these people who aren't your kind of classic employee who moves over for at least a period of several months. But the kind of self-employed people, entrepreneurs, it's really difficult to develop a sort of rules-based immigration system that accurately identifies who those people are going to be. And a lot of governments around the world have had real trouble with entrepreneur visas, basically trying to capture the vision of this usually young high-tech startup person, and not necessarily end up with businesses that they're not that excited about in lower productivity industries. So there's a host of those sorts of questions where I think there will be gaps, and some of them probably inevitable. I guess the other example would be people who sort of come over for for a few days at a time wouldn't necessarily qualify. They wouldn't be allowed in just on a business visit without a visa. But are they going to apply, sit down, apply, pay massive fees and so forth just to come over for a sort of 5-day visit? Probably not. So that, I think, is where the system will struggle, and a lot of countries struggle with it. I think it might end up just being essentially a cost of doing business under a system that doesn't have free movement.
Thank you. Brendan, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts as well about perhaps from employer perspectives, what some of these gaps in this points-based system may be.
Yeah, so so as I said before, I think you know, the big issue for the big end of town, for big business, is around how are they going to be able to operate in a sort of a regional headquarters. London is the headquarters for a lot of EMEA and European operations, and the UK, the perception is that it's less able to function in that sense, given the removal of the right of free movement. Now, business will adjust to it, and you're not going to see a mass departure, but what you will see is a slow leak. And I think that could be very damaging for the UK if there isn't a short-term travel solution, a business travel relaxation around some of the rules to allow for more permissible activities on business visas and like, to have that buffer to allow for the travel within the EU without undermining the concept of the removal of free movement, without it is possible to achieve it without undermining the labour market. But it's really through the use of technology. So, you know, in my view, the universal electronic travel authority concept, particularly the fact that it's a check-in, check-out, is actually good in that sense, because it maintains public confidence in the system. It doesn't undermine the labour market, but it does allow for government to adjust its policy to lessen the impact of Brexit and the like. You know, the business community hates change. It hates uncertainty and grey. I think the points test system overall will improve clarity. It will continue to achieve what it needs to achieve. But points-based systems, and I had, you know, years of experience in the Australian points-based system. Points-based systems are long-term levers. What the government has to be careful of is the short-term impact. And as I've said, you know, I think that the small to medium businesses are really going to struggle, and they are a major powerhouse of the economy. And so if there isn't a reduction in cost and a simplification of the process for them to be able to sponsor employees and fill those gaps, I think that the consequences are going to be quite severe. And then finally, I do believe that there is a gap in the sort of trade occupations, in the hospitality industry, in some of what's considered the lower paid jobs. And I think that the broad prohibition on any sort of low skilled occupations is not a smart policy to introduce too bluntly. You know, you may work to that over time, but you have to sort of question, if you're only bringing migrants in at the very high skilled level, are you not forcing UK employees, potential employees, school leavers, into occupations that don't have the sort of higher income earning potential? You know, the jobs that they're going to be offered are going to be at that lower end, and you're sort of locking them in a little bit. So I think a more balanced approach in the point system is going to be necessary, but you'll get that through experience. The framework is there. We just need to build into that. But as I said, my concern for the UK is around the short-term impact.
Thank you, Brendan. Martin, perhaps Brendan spoke about the impact of large businesses. I'd be very interested in your thoughts on the impact on small and medium businesses in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to echo a lot of what Brendan said, but I mean, it's worth reminding us that at the last recession, roughly 80 to 90% of the new jobs were created by SMEs and the self-employed. So they are the vehicle where you can work your way out of a crisis like this. And as Madeleine said, the arrangements for the self-employed are pretty clunky, to say the least. I mean, I think the the requirements for capital and qualifications mean in the last year, they've had 14 applicants. Now, if you think you've got a population of something like 5 million self-employed and small business owners, and you get 14 applicants for that kind of sector, that has to be something that needs review. And then the other thing is the speed of change. You know, we're talking about a market that changes really rapidly, and it will change even more quickly in the next few months. And you've got a system that can only respond every 3 years. So at the very least, you need to review the shortage occupation list annually, or maybe more frequently, frankly. But, you know, a system that's so slow to respond to changes in market conditions has to be a bad idea.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I have two more questions. I'll direct the first one to Martin and Brendan, which is, you know, this points-based immigration system and the pressures that it might create for employers in particular following COVID-19. What pressures do you think will be created for employers? I'd be very interested in your thoughts, Brendan.
So I think overall for the big end of town, again, I just say they'll take it in their stride once they get used to it. You know, they're used to the overall structure. This is nothing that they haven't seen in other jurisdictions, Canada, Australia, etc. So I think, you know, the big end of town will be fine. They're going to be more interested in that intra-regional sort of travel, and I'm not just talking about the EU, but you know how do you run a headquarters operation from London if it's sort of seen as more isolationist. So you know, I think the big end of town, they'll be okay. But in the other sectors, I really think that exactly to what Martin said, that the points-based system is really focused on those long-term sort of population policy issues and the sort of structural reform of the skilled migration area. But it changes constantly. It changes for big business as well, but they can, as I said, can take that in their stride. But the small and medium enterprise businesses, the gaps that are going to exist here are going to come from a lack of awareness, a lack of experience in the system, the cost. I keep coming back to the cost, but the UK is by far the most expensive country in the world that I know of to apply for a visa in comparative terms. I mean, it is outrageously expensive. And so you know, I think that if the UK is going to be competitive, and to the points made earlier, you are in a global marketplace competing for the right sort of migrants that you want. In that sort of an environment, the cost of, you know, over the period of a sponsorship for a small business of £4,000 or so in the sort of total cost, that's an expensive proposition. And you know, every immigration study ever done shows that if an employer can get their skilled workers from the local workforce, they'll do so. They won't sponsor someone from overseas unnecessarily. So they're going there for a reason in the first place. So simply, you know, as I said, I think the UK has the basics right. I think it's in place. There's some short-term tweaking because of the unintended consequences of Brexit being masked by the pandemic. And there are some short-term levers using technology, looking at business travel policies, streamlining for smaller medium enterprise. That's what the government needs to focus on.
And would you broadly agree with that, Martin?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be a bit of a double act here again, me and Brendan. I think the figure that we were coming up with was roughly about 3,000, excluding legal. So probably Brendan's figure of 4K is about right. And we did some surveys, and you know, of the people normally using overseas labour, 48% of them said they couldn't afford that. You know, that would be out of the question. They couldn't deal with that kind of cost. And the maximum anybody would consider it before they would start shrinking their operation would be about £1,000. They thought that was a reasonable figure that they could cope with. Of course, the other thing, and Brendan mentioned it earlier, is the bureaucracy. The whole system is unfamiliar to them and very clunky. So if you can get some sort of online tools that ease their way through this, that would make a massive difference as well. But, you know, broadly speaking, I would reinforce everything Brendan said earlier.
Great. So Heather, you know, in this post-COVID world, how do you think the economic and political agenda has responded to these new and pressing demands for jobs and skills? Has it been adequate enough, and what do you think could improve?
Well, I don't think we've seen the response yet, really, because what we've seen is businesses just trying to get themselves back on track. Mm-hmm. Re-employing people who've furloughed, or then rebuilding businesses. We've probably seen new businesses set up. But I think what we started to see before the pandemic was employers making much more of an effort to recruit alternative sources of labour. So the research that I did with the CIPD found employers were very keen. They always are very keen, as Brendan said, to recruit from the local labour market first, and that migration is the second option in most cases. And employers are very keen to recruit young people, but there's a problem in many sectors, particularly the lower skilled, lower paid sectors, of not having career routes. And so employers in hospitality in particular were trying to get those going. And I think that is also a problem for SMEs that don't necessarily have the structures and have the career paths that people can go to. They don't have enough higher level jobs that people can. And I think there's other issues that need to be addressed with lower skilled, lower paid work, which make those jobs unattractive to British workers. And they are things like 0 hours contracts, very flexible hours, poor working conditions. And you can't really change the conditions of some jobs. You can't, working in a food factory, it's cold, it's unpleasant work by the nature of it. But you can probably do something about 0 hours contracts and flexible working. And when we're thinking about whether employers prefer to recruit migrants or not, the one issue that comes up is that migrant workers are much more flexible than British workers, and it's because of 0 hours contracts. So I think something needs to be done there to make those jobs more attractive to British workers. So I think we're in a very unusual situation. I think we would never have expected that the new immigration policy would be introduced at the same time as COVID. And so it complicated everything. And I think all those things that employers wanted to do to attract more British workers into those lower skilled jobs have actually probably been made much more difficult. And I think probably Martin can verify that. But I think that's something that more effort probably needs to be done, and to bring in people who are currently excluded from the labour market as well through. But I think ultimately all of those measures will still mean that migrants are needed in those jobs. And I think actually then the challenge for employers will be convincing the government that it would be legitimate to tweak the system to allow more lower skilled workers in, whether that's in particular sectors or changing the qualification threshold.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Heather. Madeleine, Heather identified a number of areas or challenges in a post-COVID world that existed even before COVID. Would you broadly agree with that, or are there more challenges you think that we should, the political and economic agenda should be focusing on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. These are all challenges. I think in terms of the sort of immigration system, the policy approach kind of coming out of the COVID crisis has broadly been business as usual. Well, that's okay. That's not totally fair in the sense that obviously the Home Office has made quite a lot of adjustments to existing routes in the immigration system to accommodate some of the difficult individual circumstances that people have had. The basic design of the system hasn't changed as a result. As I said before, there's this question, well, should it? There are some arguments that actually you have to think about the medium and long term anyway. I guess if you wanted to construct an argument that the policy agenda should change, then I guess one of the arguments you can look at is the fact that businesses are already struggling because of COVID, and therefore they may be less able to handle some of the extra costs that Martin and Brendan alluded to, and particularly for small employers, some of the bureaucracy. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting looking at the data is that there hasn't been much of an increase in the number of employers who have sponsor licenses under the new system. And so we may have a fair number of employers who get a shock when they realize what faces them, when they think, okay, I'd like to hire someone, let's see how this thing works. And then they realize, oh, there's a whole big process here. And so I think in many ways, businesses probably more so because of COVID than we would otherwise have seen are probably just not prepared for the new system. These kinds of arguments, they have always applied. The UK chooses to have a very expensive immigration system, and that has costs and benefits. Those changes aren't fundamentally different, but I think they are sort of more vivid now in the light of COVID.
So Salma, the kind of broad themes that are coming out are the cost and bureaucracy around work visas. Would you agree that those are kind of two areas or two challenges that might have been exacerbated problems for businesses during COVID, and they should be tackled appropriately?
Well, cost is always a problem for business, and trying to keep that down is obviously the name of the game for most accountancy departments. I think that the British system is uniquely expensive because it pays for itself. And if you have a self-funding border, and it's basically there to the visa costs are there to sort of pay for the border, inevitably it's going to be expensive. I think there is an argument for the economic departments like business and treasury to think about actually providing a little bit more if it wants to start incentivizing these entrepreneurs to actually come to the UK and start taking advantage of the other things that we've got going on in the economy for high skills and innovative people to come and take advantage of. But I think one of the issues is that it's there to pay for something, and therefore the cost is always going to be quite high unless we change that fundamentally. I think the other point is when you think about what's going to happen post-COVID, yes, we are yet to see really what the impact is going to be. What I think is going to be fascinating is what happens with different sectoral interests and how they then start approaching government. So we've obviously talked a lot about hospitality and the fact that it's seen as low skilled and thinking about those career routes to upskill people in the hospitality industry. But given it has had such a sort of crushing time during COVID, perhaps there is an argument to grant it a special exemption that the Treasury would be interested in looking at. So I think people are going to have to be a lot more dynamic as a consequence of this new system to start thinking about how they're going to approach government when they start lobbying. Because as Martin rightly pointed out, having a system that essentially works in a 3-year cycle is crazy. Which is the point that I was trying to make earlier about this system, being different to what we had before. It was far more flexible previously for that reason, to meet sectoral challenges and shortages. So broadly, I think we're yet to see what's going to happen as a consequence of COVID. I do think that when we think about immigration and economic immigration, I think it's worth being a little bit more holistic about it. And I think government itself is quite bad at thinking about immigration holistically. And what do I mean by that? So how does the immigration piece fit into the levelling up piece, for example? And making a case that ties those two things closer together and then playing in the skills piece. So we've just heard a lot about how businesses would always choose to hire locally where possible. Part of the problem is our own inability to be able to upskill in some of the areas that businesses are based, and therefore they do have to import labour at all levels, not just low skill or medium skill, high skill as well. And that is where we need to actually play some catch up. So there needs to be, I think, a much more kind of cross-government understanding about what the objective is in this very narrow element of immigration, which I think sometimes in Westminster gets slightly lost with all the other issues around immigration. So it becomes this big homogenous whole that lumps in skilled migration in with people coming over in small boats, to spousal visas, to cultural immigration. And I think creating that distinction is very difficult, but something I think the government has to do if it is going to get this particular part of its immigration system right.
Thank you. So now we have a little under 30 minutes for audience questions, and we have a lot of audience questions. So that I think I would also encourage people watching to please submit more under Slido under the hashtag immigration work. So perhaps what I'll do is I can read out the question and approach the panelists I feel would want to answer that. But please, if you'd like to contribute, please do raise your hand, and I can approach you as well in this way. So the first question is from Jen Fackelman. How do you foresee the flexible working arrangements proposed by some large companies impacting the future of global mobility for professionals? So this question is on flexible working. Perhaps Martin, we could start with you.
You're probably approaching the wrong guy on large corporates with flexible working, but yeah, it may be one that Brendan can answer better than me. Okay,
Brendan.
So this is around, I think, around the concept of the digital nomad, and the idea of have a laptop, can work from anywhere. There's a lot of talk around this at the moment. In my view, it's probably a sort of a short-term phenomenon. Coming from COVID, I think that business will fall back into a more sort of standard business model over time. But I think that there is an opportunity for the UK to look at a policy that is specifically tailored for digital nomads, and to capture some of that, because that is where sometimes you can get some of that entrepreneurialism that we were talking about earlier, that's so difficult. So it's such a great concept, but it's so difficult to get it right. The digital nomad concept can actually assist in that. But like so many of these things, it goes beyond just immigration policy and goes to tax and employment policies around, what impact does it have on health insurance and the like. But I think that within a reasonable amount of control, and where the British government is taking steps to make sure that this doesn't have undesirable costs associated with it, like accessing the health system, etc., then a focus on the digital nomad concept is probably beneficial for the UK, and will certainly I wouldn't see a major downside to it. So I think it is something the British government needs to have a look at and introduce. But if it's going to do so, it needs to move quickly. I mean, this is not something that's got to be 12 months in the making. Have a look at it now, introduce the changes, and then when it peters out, get rid of the program.
Okay, I have a question from Robert Wright from the FT. The government's rhetoric on immigration is increasingly harsh. Can businesses still regard the harsh stance towards asylum seekers as not their problem? Perhaps, Salma, you'd like to answer that?
Robert is on the FT, as you've just said, and one of, I think, the best journalists in the UK on talking about immigration issues. So I'm going to be slightly flummoxed as to his question. He raises a really important point, because whilst we might treat sort of immigration in a very siloed way, it's actually a tonal thing. So earlier in this discussion, I talked about India. Why did I talk about India? Because I've done a lot of economic departments before I went to the Home Office, and one of the issues that we kept butting against in India was this idea that we were so incredibly negative in our rhetoric around immigration that people really didn't want to come to the UK. They weren't favouring the UK for study and other things. And so I think Robert has a point. And I think that we do have to address the tone around immigration and refugees. I think we have to be clear about what we mean when we think about certain issues in relation to people coming over in small boats crossing, where I absolutely 100% agree with what the Home Secretary said in her speech earlier about not incentivising criminal gangs who exploit people. And I think she's absolutely right to be harsh on that, but distinguishing that from the way that we treat asylum seekers, so that the overall tone of the government does continue to be pro-immigration.
Thank you. Martin, I can see you have your hand up.
Well, seeing I dodged the last question, I thought I'd better respond to this one. And essentially, I thought there was a sort of artificial difference made in some of the discussion earlier about, well, security and economic issues should be separated, and that the Home Office was wholly security-based considerations. But it seems to me that if you're going to count people in and count them out, you can be a lot more flexible about the kind of people you're prepared to let in and those you don't want to stay here for very long. So I would have thought there is a really close link between the immigration system and asylum system you set up and the response to the commercial pressures that you're going to introduce. And this distinction between security and economic issues, I think, is a bit false.
Can I just respond to that 1 second, Martin? So it might be the case that you have to, as I've said, have a holistic view in government. But the problem is where your responsibilities sit. The Home Secretary is responsible for security. And that's why I say it's very important for us to understand what is the discussion outside of the Home Office in relation to Treasury and the Business Department that is actually creating that holistic view. Because the Home Office cannot do it by itself. The Home Secretary job is the hardest one in government, and there is no good news in that job. So, I think the other economic departments do need to step up a little bit.
Agreed.
There's a question here which says, from Anonymous, which says, only bringing migrants at the high level will increase competition for British talent and push low skills development. Will Britain really be better off? Heather, I know you discussed that a little bit, so perhaps you'd like to answer that question.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I wasn't quite sure.
It says, only bringing migrants at the high level will increase competition for British talent and push low skills development. Will Britain really be better off?
I'm not really sure that's the case. So is it saying that basically it will mean that there'll be more competition for jobs at higher level? I'm not really sure. I think the point really is that employers require skills at all different levels, and when they and I think, as Brendan said earlier, that they would prefer to recruit them locally, partly because of cost, partly because of image, partly because of local people, and British people are their customers. And then when they can't get them, they will recruit. I don't think that. So if the question was alluding to if you recruit fewer migrants into lower skill work, then more jobs will become available, that really isn't how it works. So people won't have more opportunities because jobs are advertised locally. Even though the resident labour market test has gone, employers will still seek local labour first, and they will then look to migrants when they can't recruit sufficient people. And I think we discussed some of the reasons for that in this discussion, and some of those issues can be addressed by making jobs a bit more attractive, by having better career routes. But it's not just a question if you don't allow migrants into those jobs that more opportunities will become available to local people. In fact, it works the other way around.
Madeleine, would you like to comment on that?
Sure, yeah. I thought I should chip in. There's been actually quite a lot of research on this question now about the sort of impacts of immigration on people in different parts of the labour market. And I think, as Heather alluded to, one of the things that many people find really surprising is that the statistical evidence we have shows that the impacts of immigration policy actually tend to be pretty small. So that it's been essentially impossible to find any negative impact of highly skilled immigration on other high skilled workers. There, I think there's pretty much a consensus among economists that there are actually sort of complementarities, that bringing in more high skilled people then essentially it helps to create a kind of more dynamic high-skilled labor market and labor, so high-skill intensive industries. There's a little bit more of a question that I would say there's more uncertainty in when it comes to low-wage jobs, but even there, to be honest, economists have really struggled to find any significant impact. So it's one of those ones where I think sort of intuitively people feel like there ought to be an impact there, but in practice, it's been very difficult to find one.
I have a question here from Anonymous. How will the new plan affect those working illegally and businesses employing illegal people? Cash in hand still makes it very easy. So this is more of a question about illegal workers. Perhaps, Madeleine, you'd like to comment on that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think under the new immigration system, these things are really difficult to predict, but one would expect that there will be more pressure for irregular migration than there was in the past, essentially because there is no plan for any legal routes for people to take up work in low-wage jobs. We have some other ingredients of kind of pressure for irregular migration. So you obviously will have visa-free travel from European countries. You have existing networks that make it in principle easier for people to find jobs. And so I think, while these things are always difficult to measure, all else equal, we should expect that that will become more of a challenge. And then, of course, that has knock-on impacts. Businesses obviously face penalties if they are identified employing someone with no right to work, which is one of the reasons that it's you often tend to see irregular working in industries with very low profit margins, particularly smaller businesses, where we know that there can be more struggles across the board with compliance with government regulations, and it's not really an easy problem to address, to be honest. I don't think there is sort of, regardless of what the politicians like to say, I don't think that there are sort of magic solutions that will end illegal working overnight. I think it's something basically that all immigration systems struggle with.
Brendan, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment that the concept of, cash under the table sort of thing is really not one restricted just to migrants and to foreign nationals. I mean, that applies in any industry group where, they don't want to put them on the books for whatever reason. And there is, in my view, more than enough government regulation in place already to act as a disincentive to businesses doing this, with the first day check regime and the like. The UK has enough checks and balances to discourage that sort of illegal workers. And to some of the points and the themes that have been raised before, there is a limit to what government should be doing here. That you're not going to be able to account for everything, and that if there is too heavy-handed an approach with business, then that can really start to act as a disincentive to the concept of the UK being a member of the international business community. So, there has to be a real sensitivity around over-regulating in these sorts of areas. And I'm not suggesting at all that the government doesn't take it seriously. All I'm saying is that it actually does already in this space, and that the perception of illegals working under the counter and everything else is no different to any other business sector.
Heather, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say that I think that one development which might be on the cards is to introduce more temporary migration schemes, particularly in the kind of lower skilled sectors. And I'd have a bit of a warning there in terms of irregular migration, because we had sector-based schemes in the past, I believe in hospitality and in food processing. And then what happened is that people stayed on after. The employers were expected to enforce migration policy, which they're always very reluctant for obvious reasons to do. They don't want to become the border police. And also in terms of the public tends to dislike temporary migration routes because they create more churn in communities. They like migrants who settle and who integrate. But I think, concerns about irregular migration might increase if we had more of those kind of temporary schemes. So I just warn, actually, I think that would be quite a bad policy development, and a way of kind of short-term, trying to address short-term problems would actually create longer-term ones.
We have a question from Alex Carter. Are there any plans to revise government fees? As a company, we are growing our footprint in the Netherlands as the authorities are more welcoming to foreign talent. So Salma, perhaps you'd like to answer that question?
Can you? I think my internet just cut out a bit. Can you give that question to me again?
Sure. It was from Alex, and he was discussing whether there were plans to reduce fees and essentially make Britain more competitive, because as a company, they tend to go to the Netherlands to attract foreign talent. So I don't think that there are any plans to reduce the fees, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is that the border has to be self-sustaining. And I think that if we were thinking about, I think we do put people off because of the price, and I'm not just talking about business. Generally, people wanting to apply to be British, is expensive. And I don't know if there's some kind of like psychological idea of a mark of quality or something like that, because you're having to pay more to be British. That might be some kind of behavioural thing that they're thinking about. But I think because of those reasons, because the Home Office budget is so tiny by comparison of what it has to deliver, I don't think that they're going to reduce fees, but I think that there's a recognition in lots of parts of government that that is a problem. Thank you. So I'm just looking for some more questions here. This one is from Dennis Joseph. It's quite a technical one, but interesting nonetheless. What are the considerations for returning workers, students and their families coming back to their host countries from home countries? And here he talks about vaccine flights, immigration systems, etc. So Brendan, perhaps you could answer that and the impact that COVID might have had on workers and their mobility.
If I'm not sure I'm following the question entirely. If it's around, what's the impact on people that are leaving is it about the UK going back to their home country? I'm not sure I'm following.
I think the question is based on the impact that COVID may have had on the mobility of people who may have been from coming back to the UK, where they're normally based here, but maybe in their home countries, and students and their families, and the effect that COVID might have had on that.
Sure. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, look, it absolutely has had an impact, obviously, but it's had a global impact. I am fairly confident that things will return to a degree of normalcy fairly quickly. I think, business travel is certainly going to be reduced, but students and the like, once the vaccines are more readily available and travel returns, I think you will see a return of student populations and the like. I don't think the impact of that is going to be in the long term. I think 12 months from now we're going to see a return to whatever is the new normal, but it's certainly going to be closer to what we were used to before. I do think that in the interim, we're going to need to look, the British government and other governments going to need to look at vaccination passports of some form, as unpopular as that may be. It's just going to be a reality in the medium term, and over the next 12 months or so. But beyond that, I think that things will return to in that sector will return to a reasonable degree of normalcy fairly quickly.
Thank you. Madeleine, did you want to comment?
Sure, yeah, I can chip in on this one. So there have been actually some quite interesting patterns with migration over the last year, because as you can imagine, it's been dramatically affected by COVID. And there's now some evidence that people who were already in the UK, whose visas were expiring, brought forward their departure, so they left earlier. Whereas people who had visas to come to the UK arrived later or put off their arrival entirely. There's a big debate and a lot of uncertainty statistically about how many people left the UK in 2020 due to the pandemic. The stats are all over the place, so we don't have an answer. Anecdotally, it's clear that a lot of people spent time working from other countries during the lockdowns in the UK. And this, I think, has some interesting implications for what happens next. Obviously, some of those people, they may actually have never, on paper, they may never have left the UK, in the sense that they may still be registered at a UK address, and it would be not visible to the system, as it were, that they're not here. There will, and those people may come back, and essentially we would never know that they were gone. There will be other people who might struggle to come back or might have problems as a result of their absences. And so one group, for example, is people with EU citizens with pre-settled status under the EU settlement scheme, who are going to have to reapply to the EU settlement scheme if they want to be able to stay permanently. They're going to have to apply for settled status. And for those people, if they've spent long periods outside of the UK, it could jeopardize their ability to apply for settled status further down the line. And we don't really know at this stage how well aware people are of that requirement. So it'll be, I think, one of the sort of challenges as we come out of the pandemic will be, as people want to come back to the UK, does their immigration status permit it, and are various problems storing up for them?
Thank you. Question from Patel. How do self-employed gig economy workers work with visas in the new system? So I suppose they're asking about particular challenges that self-employed individuals or gig economy workers might face in obtaining visas under the new points-based system. Perhaps, Heather, would you like to comment on that?
I'm afraid that self-employed is not really my area of expertise.
Brendan or Martin, perhaps?
I can come in there if you like. The self-employed situation is really fraught with all sorts of problems. They have a very high level of capital requirement that they have to demonstrate, and they have to demonstrate very high qualifications. I think the view from government, and Salma may be in a better position to confirm this, is that this was actually a way in which people leaked into the country. They didn't comply with employment regulations and came in as self-employed, and there was a desire to close this down. But it's been so brutal that it's now essentially made self-employment as an option virtually disappear.
Yeah, I might just jump in with a quick comment that this is sort of around the concept of the digital nomad, which is something the government may want to have a look at. But I have to agree with Martin again, that self-employed gig economy workers and the like, if they don't fit into the entrepreneurial sort of investor class categories, or a digital nomad sort of policy, it's very difficult to accommodate them in a structured immigration system without taking on a pretty high level of risk of abuse and undermining the system that impacts all of the other areas in immigration. It is appropriate that the focus be on a connection between an employer and their employee in the overall picture. So, you know, there might be some way to accommodate some degree of it through a digital nomad policy, but it's a very difficult area, and most governments struggle with the same issue.
Thank you. So, and in our last few minutes, and we've taken quite a few questions, so I think I have a little bit of time to just tie up some of the general themes that we discussed today. We spoke about the impact of the new points-based system on the British economy, the challenges and gaps it might present, and the improvements that need to be made. We also discussed the additional pressures that a point-based system may present to employers, particularly following the impact of COVID and also Britain's exit from the EU. And we discussed more broadly the economic and political agenda's ability to respond to the demands and to retain its competitiveness in our much needed labour force from abroad and their skills. So covered a lot in the session today, and we're very, very grateful on behalf of Bright Blue and British Futures to our wonderful panelists for your time today and for joining us. So thank you very much. Given we have 3 minutes left, perhaps I could ask the remaining 4 panelists just for a quick 30-second or up to 1 minute summing up of what you think the government needs to focus on most to improve migration for work following Brexit and following COVID. So perhaps Madeleine, I could start with you.
Sure. So I'm afraid, as a data nerd, this one's a really easy one for me, which is that we do need some better data, because there have been so many changes to the immigration system over the last 20 years. And many of the policies that have been implemented, we simply actually just don't know what their impacts were because we never had the data to evaluate them. And it would be a real pity, especially now as we have EU citizens coming under the Home Office ambit and able to, the Home Office will have data on those people for the first time. It really seems like this would be a good moment to try and improve the data for, trying to get a sense of what the impacts of these policies actually are.
Thank you. Brendan?
In 30 seconds, I'd say that overall, the UK system does work. It compares favourably with other countries. I think that the reforms coming in are useful, subject to the issues I talked about before around a route for trade occupations and small to medium enterprise. But I do really worry about the masked impact of the removal of the right of free movement that's been masked by the pandemic, and that the government may need to look at some short-term but quite fast action, fast impact moves to buffer the impact of that on British employers.
Thank you. Martin?
I think, as a sort of quick summary, I'd say, look, we've just come through a COVID crisis. It's hiding a lot of problems. And I think you cannot then burden the average SME with a lot of costs and bureaucracy at a time when you need them to be as flexible as possible. So it's echoing what Brendan says about, let's try and give ourselves some breathing space before we go for a fully fledged points-based system.
And finally, Heather.
So I would say stop making policy on the basis of assumed public opinion, and to listen to the public, which is what the Home Secretary said this morning. So to really listen to the public, not just listen to the loud voices who are opposed to immigration, but actually listen to what the public is really saying and what they want.
I think we may have lost Heather there, but her point was on listening to what the public wants, a very important point indeed. So as we're ending our time together today, thank you so much to our panelists for joining us, and to our audience, please do stick around and tune into our second panel, which will
and I've lost me now.
our second panel will be hosted by British Futures, and it's coming up on asylum seeking and the challenges and opportunities that presents for the new announcements today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.